Hello. This poster titled Anglophone Caribbean Creole: Rethinking Equity Through a Sociolinguistic Analysis is presented by Bernard Malcolm of the St. George's University and Bernil Malcolm of the Penn State University. The framework of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging seeks to create spaces that evoke feelings of fairness and justice for all. Typically, conversations about identity focus on other dimensions, and little is mentioned about linguistic diversity outside of sociolinguistic and language teaching conversations. However, language forms just as an important part of how people identify themselves and negotiate their identity in social settings. In contexts where speakers of various languages exist, Swift acknowledges that essentialized notions of language elicit certain linguistic practices that may not align with the identities of the interlocutors. These notions are grounded in the social construct of race, where one group of people is made to be superior while disparaging anyone who does not belong to that group. Crump adds that these notions and related perceptions about language are historically constructed, maintained and passed on from generation to generation. This is a form of oppression, racism disguised as a focus on linguistic differences. This is especially the case where non-native speakers of a language interact with native speakers of the language. The latter are usually relegated to positions of power, while the former are subordinated. Non-natives who are made to feel that the form of the language they speak is inferior have difficulties using the language in certain spaces due to the fear and social anxiety they feel about using said language inappropriately. This phenomenon is also common in contexts where varieties of a language coexist. It is common mostly in countries once colonized by powers like the British and the French, such as those in the Caribbean. Particularly in the Anglophone Caribbean, there exists a form of diglossia where there are high and low varieties of English used in different settings and serving different purposes. The high variety typically refers to a standard dialect of the language, while the low variety refers to a non-standard dialect, or Creole. As with language spoken by natives and non-natives, the varieties of English spoken in the Caribbean receive varying levels of prestige and ridicule, with the standard variety favored and attributed a level of prestige over the Creole. This has significant effects on the way in which users of the language identify and perceive themselves in various settings. Language is socially constructed, and the ideas and perceptions of the users of the varieties of a language are embedded in the way these varieties are used. In the Caribbean context, language use and linguistic style tend to be associated with social class and intellect. People associate Creole with low socioeconomic status and Standard English with a higher socioeconomic status. Critical language and race theory, or LANCRIT, an offshoot of critical race theory, emphasizes the intersectionality of multiple facets of identity which include language. The theoretical framework of LANCRIT considers the way in which race and language intersect to shape expressions and possibilities for being in varied contexts. Crump explains that LANCRIT seeks to describe the way in which people use language and to uncover the reasons that certain contexts and spaces elicit certain linguistic practices from speakers. These are all applicable to the English-speaking Caribbean and the language issues that exist when considering standard and non-standard varieties of English. However, a slight modification to this framework is proposed, a focus on the relationship between language, class, and intellect. These factors play an integral role in the language ideologies that exist and the linguistic practices that occur. As our methodology, we've utilized a critical duo-ethnographic approach to capture and recount our lived experiences of our linguistic encounters and practices. Duo-ethnography is a qualitative research method that allows reflective inquiry among two researchers. We serve as the data sources and we analyze said data, and as such we engage in significant dialogue and reflection. We address the results and discussion hand in hand. A number of themes have emerged from our lived experiences. First, people's perception and use of language are influenced by the ideologies of language. Language ideologies refer to what people feel and believe about aspects of language, such as varieties. As Crump theorized, people's perceptions of us as we use Standard English or Creole indicate their linguistic ideologies. In certain settings, they assume we are at certain intellectual levels based on the variety we use. In spaces where people typically use the standardized variety of English, using the Creole would mean that we are perceived as intellectually inferior and of a low class. Similarly, in settings where the more common variety is Creole, using the standard variety means that we would either be relegated to a perceived place of high intellectual ability and social class, or, in some cases, be ridiculed for using such a variety in that time and place. This leads to another two-dimensional theme. Linguistic boundaries limit our use of English and self-expression. Boundaries around language have been socially constructed and maintained. They stem from the ideologies that emerged years ago during colonialization and are maintained by the continued use of one variety over another in certain spaces because it is more acceptable than others. The constant scolding to speak properly by parents and teachers, and the ridicule people feel when they use the wrong variety in settings. All these behaviors reinforce the language ideologies of superior and inferior varieties of language. The need to maintain these boundaries forces us into a box. It forces us to display fixed identities, since these boundaries are imposed on us when we may prefer to enact different aspects of our identity. It robs us of the opportunity to portray fluidity of identity. This makes users of multiple varieties question their own concept of self. However, we also hone the useful skill of style shifting, which is the tendency of speakers of multiple varieties of a language to switch between varieties based on sociolinguistic context. Another theme arising is that of psychosocial effects. The feelings of shame we have felt for using the incorrect variety in different settings has fed into the anxiety we felt and still sometimes feel when we speak in certain spaces. We have always been so conscious of what we said and the way we said it. We propose the following as implications for interactions and practice as we attempt to change ideologies about language and deconstruct and reconstruct linguistic social constructs. Reflect on biases, personally and with others. We can engage in educated discussions of linguistic biases, and we may even uncover some unconscious biases we hold. Create spaces where people feel comfortable to use any variety once intelligibility is achieved. Language is a form of expression and people should feel comfortable to use it how they want to, in social settings, in professional settings, in academic settings. Use the skill of style shifting to our advantage. Meet people where they are, but use that as an opportunity to expose others to integration of different varieties in unusual contexts, to deconstruct some of these social constructs and begin moving boundaries. And lastly, push for linguistic variation as one of the aspects of diversity equity, inclusion, and belonging at institutional levels. In the words of Lemke, as cited in Crump, it is not at all obvious that if they were not politically prevented from doing so, languages would not mix and dissolve into one another. In a similar way, if we were to begin removing the socially constructed boundaries that exist between varieties of English in the Caribbean, we would start to see less and less distinction, and notions of standard and non-standard along with the associated psychosocial and identity issues would begin to disappear.